Hey everybody, this is Joey Meyer. Let's go over chapter 4 of the PowerPoint. Chapter 4 is about tissues. So we're going to talk about levels of organization a little bit, about 4 major types of tissues and functions that they have. So the 4 major types of tissues. Well, first, obviously, a collection of tissues of the same type, a collection of cells of the same type that perform a common function. Usually we say you need 2 types of cells to form a tissue, but whatever the book says, we'll go with what the book says. I've always been taught that you needed 2 different types of tissues. But anyway, 2 different types of cells to be a tissue. Anyway, the book is listing 4 different types of tissues: connective tissue, muscular tissue, nervous tissue, epithelial tissue. I know you can see them right there. One of the things that I want to add here, they'll get to it eventually in the PowerPoint, but blood is considered to be a connective tissue. That's an important thing to know. And you're like, how? I mean, blood is not bone. I mean, it's not joints. And, well, yeah, this is a little bit of a rhetorical trick. You can sort of justify it by saying that since it carries nutrients to everything, carries oxygen to everything, the blood connects the respiratory system, the digestive system, to the rest of the body. I know that's a stretch, but just work with me here. Connective tissue, blood will be classified as a connective tissue. That's the way it is. Anyway, muscular tissue, those are your muscles. And you can see these definitions are just sort of scratching the surface. Muscular tissue moves the body and its parts. Yeah, that's good, but the smooth muscle in your blood vessels controls your blood pressure and controls whether or not capillaries are even getting blood. And of course, then you have your heart, which pumps the blood. So we'll get into more of this as we go on through the class. Anyway, so it says here the relationship among cells, tissues, and organs. That's pretty straightforward. The cells that work together are tissues. Tissues, different types of tissues working together, form organs. And then organs work together to form organ systems. Let me give you an example. So, say you have cells. Everybody knows your heart has muscle cells. I just talked about that. But if you think of muscles in like your arm, sorry, it's supposed to be show you my bicep, but that didn't work real well. There we go. If you think of, there we go. If you think of the muscles here, your biceps is going to have muscle cells that pull. They pull on bone. That's how you move a joint. The muscle cells pull on bone. What are muscle cells in the heart pulling on? Well, the answer is that there's another type of cells there making a protein skeleton, air quotes. It's not a skeleton because it's not made of bone, but there's a protein scaffold, and those muscle cells attach to this protein scaffold. So I'll just describe. What you would see is, let's jump down. All right. All right, so explain the relationship among cells, tissues, organs at the biological level. Cells make up tissues, all right? Cells of the same kind working together are a tissue. Tissues working together form organs, The example I was trying to use of that was the organs, like the heart, has both the scaffolding making cells and the muscle cells that pull on it to squeeze the heart to pump the blood. All right. And then organs, of course, work together to make organ systems. So we don't just have the stomach and digestion, we have the whole GI tract, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, but also all the accessory organs, things like the salivary glands and the liver making the bile, all of the pancreas making all of the digestive enzymes for the small intestine. All of the organs together will form an organ system. Anyway, distinguish between muscular tissue and nervous tissue. Easy. Muscular tissue tends to be contractile, or muscular tissue, to the best of my knowledge, is contractile. These muscle cells can get shorter and thicker. All right. And between connective tissue and epithelial tissue, connective tissue tends to be tough. Some epithelial tissue is definitely not. All right, let's move on. Describe the primary types of connective tissue and have a function for each. All right, we've already talked about the fact that blood is considered to be a connective tissue. Bone is dense, it provides protection. It also provides something for skeletal muscles to pull on to provide locomotion and make you move. Bone is going to be more heavily, it says compare the structure and function of bone. I'll definitely want you to know that bone is ossified. Bone is tough. When I say ossified, I mean it's full of calcium. It's tough. Cartilage tends to be flexible, and some of it, the elastic cartilage, is extremely flexible, but it's lighter weight and it's more flexible. Anyway, let's move on. So all connective tissues have three parts. Specialized cells, a ground substance that they are in, and protein fibers. So let's go over this. Take bone, specialized cells. You're going to have things like osteoblasts that build bone and osteoclasts that break it down, cut it apart. In fact, I want you to, when we get the skeleton and do that in depth, that's how you'll remember it. You'll see those again. And osteoblasts, the B should remind you they build bone. Osteoclasts, the C should remind you they cut bone. They cut bone. They're breaking it apart. I'm trying to do a pair of scissors here. Anyway, so specialized cells. There's an example for your bone. The ground substance in bone, that's going to be the hydroxyapatite, the tough calcium-filled material that is made. And then protein fibers. Yeah, you've got fibers embedded in it. The other day, I was doing some fiberglass, working on a car, and so bone is a lot like that, where you've got your ground substance. Think of that as like the fiberglass resin, but going through it, you have fibers. Okay. Fiberglass, of course, has a lot of fibers. Bone's not going to have as many, but the same idea. You've got a tough ground substance, and going through it, you've got fibers that provide more strength. Think of it as concrete is tough, but it's brittle. It breaks real easy. So in construction, when they pour concrete, they put metal rebar in there too. And the rebar is tough and resilient. And a lot of times you'll have things like collagen proteins that are tough and resilient and prevent the bone from just being this brittle substance that cracks. Okay, great. So we've got three components of connective tissue for bone. Let's head the other direction and do the blood. Blood, the ground substance, is going to be the Plasma, that is the fluid that stuff moves in. Specialized cells, you already know that. You got your red blood cells, you got your white blood cells. Yes, when we go over blood, we're going to talk about the never let monkeys eat bananas, the acronym to help you remember all the white blood cells, the neutrophils and lymphocytes and monocytes. So anyway, specialized cells. Blood's got plenty of specialized cells. Ground substance, blood has the plasma. Protein fibers. You might say, what? But no, think about when you have clots form, okay? You will have a rounded protein that is in the plasma moving around. It's called fibrinogen. You activate that, it unwinds and turns into fibrin. Those are the fibers that form that help make a clot. So anyway, yeah, their statement here on this slide, I guess I've been rambling, their statement that connective tissue is going to have specialized cells, ground substance, protein fibers. Yeah, it does. It doesn't matter what kind of connective tissue, it's got all three. I want you to know those three things for the test. Let's move on. All right, so fibers. There are three main types of fibers. We have collagen, which is flexible and strong. You remember I described it as tough. We have reticular fibers, which are really, really thin. They're still a type of collagen, but they're not big, thick, substantial things. They're more little filaments that go everywhere. And elastic fibers have elastin, which is a stretchy protein. If you think of your skin when you pull on it and it snaps back to its normal shape, and then you think about an older person and their skin sags, and like on their face, it sags a lot. And you know how like if you bump into a desk with your arm, the skin pulls out of the way and snaps back. If a real old person does, their skin's like parchment thin and it tears instead of stretching and coming back. Well, as we get older, it's harder to make this elastin, this stretchy protein. Anyway, so it says three main types of connective tissue are fibrous connective tissue, supportive, and fluid. Fluid, of course, blood. Let's move on. Okay, so connective tissues. It's pretty picture here on, I think maybe slide 8. Yeah, slide 8. And it shows adipose cells. Those are your fat cells. You may not have thought of that as connective tissue, but it is. It's just connective tissue that has a job that's different than bone and stuff. So adipose cells, it says, oh, they store fat. Yeah, they do. They do. But they do other stuff too. That's one of the things that you'll find in anatomy is a lot of times like, oh, it's this or it's this. And adipose cells are connective tissue. Yeah, but they have endocrine functions too and produce estrogen. Anyway, ground substance is, let's see, going back to our picture here. We've got ground substance, there's my cursor. It fills the spaces between the fibers. Elastic fibers, branch, stretchy ones, it's all great. Stem cells. Well, what do we have stem cells in connective tissue? Well, you break a bone, you're going to have to grow new cells to fill in that bone. Same thing with any tissue. You try to replace broken, damaged cells with new cells, you're going to need stem cells to grow. Collagen, strong, flexible, but big, stiff girders. Fibroblast, the name tells you what it does. Fibro, it's going to make fibers, it's going to make all the different things in connective tissue. But blast, just like when we were talking about bone, I said you have osteoblasts and osteoclasts. There are two things I want you to know about things that have blast in their name. The B in blast should remind you of baby, because this is a small cell, a young cell. Not small like size, sorry. This is a young cell. It'll probably grow up to do something else. But blast, think baby. The other thing for blast, you could think builder, because this will build other types of cells or build other types of substances. So a fibroblast is something that can divide and make other types of cells in here. Reticular fiber, we already talked about, really thin, really branched, actually still a form of collagen, just not form of these big, thick, ropey masses. All right. And here where it says a white blood cell engulfs pathogens, produces antibodies. We haven't talked about types of white blood cells, but it's possible this, I would expect this to be like a macrophage. Then it's a type of white blood cell. We'll talk about them more. And the name means big eater, literally. All right, eats things that don't belong. So types of connective tissue that we have. And you look at this little table, fluid connective tissue, your two options are blood and lymph, okay? And the big differentiation there that they draw on this chart is where they're located. There are huge differences in what's in them, though, as well. The short answer is that with the exception of roaming white blood cells, your cells inside the blood don't usually go into the lymph, okay? White blood cells, of course, are really common in lymph. But all the red blood cells, they shouldn't be in lymph. They should stay in the blood. All right, supportive connective tissue. The two options they had here were bone and cartilage. All right. If you look, bone is solid and rigid, and like I said, it's heavily ossified, full of calcium. Cartilage is a lot more flexible. It's also lighter. If you've ever been scuba diving and you see a shark wiggle into some tiny hole, like you're, how the heck do you do that? How can you fit in that space? Well, it's pretty easy to squish your way in if you're dealing with a cartilage skeleton and not bone. It's also lower weight, which is important for a fish without a swim bladder. But we're not talking about scuba diving. We're not talking about sharks. Sorry. We move on. We're sticking to anatomy here. All right. Fibrous connective tissue. It says the fibers are loose and open, and yeah, that's true. But it's the space between the fibers that sometimes counts. Like on the previous slide, we were talking about adipose tissue. It's those other cells that are in between the fibers where you're storing the fat. I want to point out that fat storage is not just, oh, I'm storing energy. Things like if you're going to protect the kidneys, on one side at least, you're hanging out a little bit below the rib cage. And how do you protect that kidney? Well, you wrap it in a capsule of fat that cushions it and protects it. Anyway, so that's loose. Dense fibrous connective tissue, that's things like your tendons and your ligaments. Remember, tendons are things that tie muscle to bone. The T in tendon reminds you it ties muscle to bone. Ligaments, the L should remind you they link things together. All right, let's move on. So fibrous connective tissue, there's loose, there's dense. They've got the fibroblasts. Loose fibrous connective tissue includes areolar tissue, reticular tissue, adipose tissue. That's the fat we were talking about before, fat tissue. Dense, that's your tendons and your bones, just like tendons and your ligaments, like I said before. The book is not wrong here when it says, oh, these connect muscles to bone. But if you, instead of saying that, if you say tendons tie muscles to bone, you've got a built-in mnemonic to help you remember the difference. The T in tendon reminds you it ties muscles to bone. The L in ligament reminds you it links muscles to bone. So I've got no problem with the way they wrote it. I just don't think it helps you remember it as well. So I'll try to throw things like that in as we move along. All right. Loose fibrous connective tissue supports the epithelium. Adipose tissue is storing fat, stores energy. Doesn't have a lot of matrix. Has adipocytes, cells that are full of fat. You can read this. This is straightforward, simple. Energy storage, insulation, cushioning. That's what I was talking about with having the fat capsule around the kidney. Found primarily under the skin, around some organs. Dense fibrous connective tissue has densely packed collagen fibers. That is talking about the ligaments and tendons that we were talking about. All right, here's the pretty picture. Loose, you can see the fibers are loosely packed. There's a lot of stuff showing up in gray here. That's the space between the fibers. All right. Hyaline cartilage. Cartilage is like we have here, like we have here. Cartilage is, sorry about that. So cartilage is a lot more flexible than bone. The matrix is not as rigid. You still, just like bone, have little cells living in spaces that we call lacunae. And you might say to yourself, well, I don't see that here in this thing of bone. Yeah, they're not zoomed in far enough. This functional unit of a bone called an osteon, when we do skeletal system, you'll need to know that. But this, if we blow that up bigger, you will see that we have little spaces that cells live in, and those are still called lacunae. It means a little lake. That's why the canaliculi, those are the little canals. Sorry, I can't point with my finger. The canaliculi, the little canals, connect the little lakes where the cells live. So, at least they stuck with the same names. When we deal with dense connective tissue, you can see there's really not much space between the fibers. It's like fiber, 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 fiber. And where you do have spaces, they're filled in with cells, with fibroblasts. So this would be like a tendon, super strong. Adipose cells, it's all the space is filled up with these fat storing cells. That's your primary function. We already talked about the fact you can do cushioning. We talked about the fact that because it's a connective tissue, you have some fibers, but you can see how rare fibers are compared to the adipose cells. So what I'm getting at here is you could have connective tissue that ranges from all fiber, that's there, to almost no fiber. But you're still going to have all three components. You're still going to have a matrix, a matrix, specialized cells, and I really need to flip this screen so it's not weird. Matrix, specialized cells, and fibers. Those are the three things, protein fibers. All right. So supportive connective tissue, we got cartilage and bone. Says structure, shape, protection. You're like, what are we talking about? Well, if you look at your ear, the shape is based on the cartilage, okay? Protection, we're talking about a skeletal system mostly. Leverage for movement. That's what I was talking about before, where if you're going, say you have your hand and you're going to move the thumb away, we call that adducting, you remember? Well, the adductor pollicis longus is a muscle that pulls on the thumb, and abductor pollicis longus. Okay, so you're going to move your thumb. You've got muscles that pull on the bone. That's the leverage they're talking about. All right. So Cartilage has chondrocytes. Chondrocytes are cells living in lacunae. They're what you saw in the previous picture. The matrix is flexible. So if we use a fiberglass example that I was talking about, what if the resin, instead of getting rigid and solid, what if, and brittle, what if that resin stayed flexible like silicone rubber does? Okay, that's what we're dealing with cartilage. Now, this thing about cartilage lacking a direct blood supply, healing slowly, that's super important. You know how the doctors always say, if you get an infection in your joint capsule, that's really, really bad. The reason why is it's almost impossible to get enough white blood cells. It's almost impossible to get enough white blood cells in to fight it because you don't have a lot of blood flow. All right, so types of cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage. We've got it here. We've got it on the ends of the long bones. We might as well talk about this. We'll do this. You'll hear this again in skeletal. But when you look at a long bone, the ends of the bone are called the epiphysis, and the middle of the bone, the shaft, that's the diaphysis. And then we have the growth plates in between the epiphyses and the diaphysis. And those growth plates stay cartilage for a lot longer. But the whole end in a fetal skeleton, the entire epiphysis on each end is hyaline cartilage. All right. Elastic cartilage, I already did the example of your ear right here, but this, see how it springs back, springs back, springs back. That's elastic cartilage. All right. And that's, you probably guessed this already, one of the main protein fiber types in elastic cartilage is elastin. That protein that I talked about that helps your skin stretch instead of tearing, the one that gets harder to make as you get older. That protein, elastin, is real common in elastic cartilage. Now, fibrocartilage is tough, gritty. This is the stuff that you have for absorbing shock, absorbing impact. So that's what you have between the discs of your vertebrae in your spine. If you ever watch pictures of those, a video of those kayakers going off a waterfall and they drop and they land on the water, they call that boofing, by the way. But where someone boofs, they're taking all of that impact, like their butt hits the water and all that impact is on the spine. Anyway, so fibrocartilage, tough. All right, bone is the stiffest and most rigid of the connective tissues that we have. The matrix is collagen and calcium salts. We're talking hydroxyapatite type things. There are two types of bone, compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone is super tough. Spongy bone tends to be lighter. And it's spongy because it has a bunch of little fibers made out of bone spicules that go this way and that, and has a lot of space between. You can store things there, like fat, like marrow. Anyway, all right, so compact bone, the shafts of the long bone, the diaphyses, made out of cylindrical structure called osteons. We already looked at those. So down here, where's my mouse there? This lower right picture where you see an osteon, what you're looking at is they cut a bone, and then they took a slice of that long bone. So here's the long bone, they cut it in the middle and they put that slice there to look at the picture. Those osteons are long shafts, and when you make the compact bone, you have you have osteon, 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 osteon. And then in the middle of that circle is where the bone marrow is. Does that make sense? Or In some animals, like birds, it's just hollow. But anyway, moving on. So each osteon is a tall vertical cylinder. In the middle, it has central canal, the blood vessels, nerves, and just like I said, the bones are also in little lakes, little spaces we call lacunae. And the lacunae are connected by little canals we call canaliculi. The ends of the long bones, remember, ends are called epiphyses. Those are compact on the outside and a thin layer, and spongy bone on the inside. It's lighter than compact bone, but really strong. It also has space where things can be kept, like it's like marrow. Okay, two types of fluid connective tissues, blood and lymph. Remember, there were three things that every connective tissue has to have: ground substance, specialized cells, and fibers, protein fibers. Those are the three things that every single connective tissue has. So, what do we have for blood? It says three formed elements. Those are the specialized cells. Well, actually, the first two are specialized cells. Red blood cells, erythrocytes. Urethra means red, okay? Those are specialized to carry oxygen. White blood cells, leukocytes. Leukos means white. Leuko means white. Those are cells that carry infection. Remember, there are multiple types of leukocytes. We already said never let monkeys eat bananas. When we go over blood in more detail, you're going to need to know that. You'll need to know that we're talking about neutrophils and lymphocytes and let monkeys, monocytes, which, by the way, those grow up to be macrophages, the big eaters. Let's see, never let monkeys eat eosinophils and basophils. Anyway, those are the types of leukocytes. Now, platelets, thrombocytes, those are big, well, sorry, those are tiny little pieces of cells. They're not true cells by themselves, but they're a big part of clotting. When those are activated, all of a sudden they grow these long extensions. And if you've ever been walking along a dam, have you ever been walking along a river and you see a bunch of branches across the river or stream, and all of the leaves and junk and stuff on the that's floating on the surface, they get backed up behind all the branches? Well, an activated platelet is like branches. It gets up to the wound where you need to form a clot, and it's got extensions going everywhere. And all of a sudden, other things like red blood cells start backing up behind it. The first part of forming a clot is a lot like having stuff across a stuff across a stream, branches across a stream, and everything starts to back up behind it. That's the first step of making a clot. And so these thrombocytes, these platelets, are cell fragments that help to collect everything. And what's interesting is those extensions they grow, those are temporary. They can be broken back down. So imagine you grow across a small wound, stuff backs up, and then you pull those in. You pull the two sides of the wound together, make it easier to close and grow new tissue. Anyway, moving on. So we talked about blood, lymph. That says derived from the fluid surrounding the tissues. What they're talking about is that around cells you have interstitial fluid. Basically, blood comes through the blood vessel, but all of the big proteins, most of the cells, they stay in the blood. But the fluid can go out. And that's actually how you deliver nutrients, how you deliver oxygen to the cells. The fluid will leave the bloodstream, and go into the interstitial fluid, it'll become part of the fluid around the cells. And that's where you do exchange of nutrients and waste, things like that. But then you have to remove it. And the way you remove it, most of that goes back into the blood, but not all of it. Lymph helps drain that extra fluid that didn't go back in the blood, drain it into lymph vessels that will eventually return this fluid to the cardiovascular system. Eventually, it becomes part of the blood again. Anyway, as you already know, I said this, red blood cells stay in the blood. Some of the white blood cells leave and they go around in the lymphatic system. All right, so we're talking about formed elements in blood. Like I said, we have the erythrocytes, the red, come on, there we go. Erythrocytes, those are the red blood cells. And then we have lymphocytes, those are the white blood cells, but we have different types of white blood cells. For instance, right here, we probably have a neutrophil. Neutrophil, I say it because of the super lumpy, weird nucleus. Here we might have a lymphocyte. I say that because it's got almost no cytoplasm and got a huge nucleus. Anyway, we'll go over this later. Platelets are the little fragments, the thrombocytes, if you want to sound nerdy. The little pieces of cells that when you activate them are super important in clotting. All right. So check your progress. 3 categories of connective tissue. Examples of each. So 3 categories. We have dense connective tissue, loose connective tissue, fluid connective tissue. Um, Actually, the way we'll do this, you should, actually, I know what we should do. Pause this video and see if you can answer these questions. Okay, welcome back. We're going on. We're done with section 4.2. We're moving on. So we're going to talk about muscle tissue now. 3 types of muscle tissue with regard to location and function. They're probably going to talk about smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and cardiac muscle. That's what I would expect. All right, so muscles are tissues that contract. The cells in muscles are called muscle fibers. And yeah, they're your 3 types: skeletal, smooth, cardiac. All right, skeletal muscles attached to the skeleton by tendons. Remember, tendons tie muscles to bone. The T reminds you that tendons tie muscles to bone. Ligaments link bones together. Okay, when we have contraction of skeletal muscle, it moves the skeleton. Almost all skeletal muscle is attached to the skeleton. A lot of people would say all, but the fact of the matter is you have a tongue. The tongue is also skeletal muscle. So there's an exception. Biology is full of exceptions. All right, so skeletal muscle is voluntarily controlled. You can choose to move the muscle. Okay, muscle fibers are really long. They can run through the whole muscle. The muscle fibers, the muscle cells can have multiple nuclei. And if it is skeletal muscle, it's going to be striated or striped in appearance. Those stripes are, let's see if I can find a pretty picture. Well, there's a picture of, oh, they have stripes. What I wanted was to show you the why. It's probably, yeah, it's not there. This is where I would be jumping to the browser to get you a nice picture, but that's not, let's not do that again without testing and getting to practice. It didn't go well. All right, anyway, So you can see there are stripes and striated. Striated means striped. Skeletal muscle is striated, it's under voluntary control. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now. Nice, orderly, you've got the stripes, it's good. Smooth muscle, I'm talking about the stuff that lines your digestive system, the stuff that lines your blood vessels, not striated. That's why it's smooth. The people who looked at the striations, they thought these little striations looked like ridges. So, oh, it's rough versus smooth. When you hear smooth muscle, just think got no stripes. All right. What that means is you don't have all the fibers lined up in exactly the same way, spaced exactly the same. What you're seeing here, what I wanted to find a picture to show you, was the stripes are caused by everything lined up the same, and here we have extra fibers, and here we have a gap with fewer fibers, and then microfilaments is what I just said. With here we have a spot with lots of microfilaments. Here we have a spot with fewer microfilaments. That's a light one, not a dark one. Anyway, smooth muscles are not lined up like that. Cardiac is striated, like skeletal muscle, but it's heavily branching. Cardiac muscles have lots of branches going in places. So anyway, smooth muscle has no striations, no stripes. Spindle-shaped cells with one nucleus instead of having lots of them. It's involuntary. Found in the walls of body organs, walls of blood vessels, obviously walls of the digestive system. So here we have a picture. It's not that it doesn't have all those fibers and things, so all those microfilaments and things, but you can see it looks smooth because they're not all lined up exactly the same. So you don't get those nice clear stripes. Now, cardiac muscle is in one spot. It's the heart. It's striated, like I said, it's striated with lots of branching. They're not saying that, they should. It's involuntary. That means we can't control it. I don't care what your yoga instructor says. I don't care about your friend who does competitive shooting. I've got a friend who swears that his heart skips a beat before he pulls the trigger, and I think he's full of it. There's none of that. Anyway, it's involuntary. You don't control it. Single nucleus, but the big thing here, intercalated discs. It says the cells are connected by intercalated discs. Have you ever looked at a colander or a strainer? Imagine you put that between two containers of water. That doesn't stop things in this container from going into that container. Stuff passes right through the holes. That's what an intercalated disc is. Heart cells are all connected to each other. If you have a buildup of ions in this cell, they're going to drift over into that cell. That's actually really, really good. What that means is when you start a muscle contraction at the pacemaker for the heart, at the AV node or the SA node, your heart has a backup system, obviously. But if you start a contraction at the pacemaker in the heart, the chemicals that cause that to happen spread through the whole heart. They go from this cell to this cell to this cell through the intercalated discs. That's really important. So I want you to know intercalated discs chemically connect all of the cells. They allow chemicals to pass from one cell to another inside the heart. All right. Cardiac muscle branching, they finally said it. Branching striated cell, single nucleus. It's found in the wall of the heart. Pumps the blood. It's involuntary. We're good with all this. All right. Check your progress. Let's do this again. I want you to put me on pause, see if you can answer those questions. After you've done that, start the video back up. Hey, we're back. Okay, let's move on. So nervous tissue, it says it's tissue that communicates between different parts of the body. Totally true. We are supposed to distinguish between neurons and neuroglia. Neurons are the cells that send signals down through the nerve. Neuroglia are their support cells. In the old days, people used to talk about it as, oh, neurons are like the copper in a wire. It's like the copper metal that sends the signal. Excuse me. And neuroglia, oh, well, they're like the insulation. Yeah, that's true, but it's an oversimplification because neuroglia have lots of jobs. They do lots of things. They're not mere insulation for the neuron. Anyway, but structure of a neuron, we're going to talk about parts. The long extension off of it is called an axon. That's what carries the nerve signal through the body. Let's move on. Okay, so neurons and neuroglia are functions. What do we do with these things? They can sense input, they can integrate. What are they talking about? They're talking about this part of the body talking to that part of the talking about this part of the body talking to that part of the body. So they coordinate their activities and they do the right thing at the right time. Now, motor output. What are we talking about there? Simple. Let's go with the nervous system. Sensory input. You see the bear. Oh no, I have to run from the bear. That's your motor output. Okay. Those are nerve signals making your muscles contract. You can run away. Great. 3 parts of a neuron: a dendrite, a cell body, and axon. Dendrites are the input to that neuron. Axons are the output. Cell body is the part that has the nucleus, the part that acts like a normal cell. In a lot of axons, you have, in a lot of neurons, not all of them, you have the dendrites coming in, feeding the signal to the cell body, and then a signal goes from there down the axon. Oh, and like I said, dendrites carry information to the cell body. Cell body has the nucleus. Axon is the output. It carries the nerve signals away. Great. There we have one. And wrapped around it, we have, it says a myelin sheath. So the axon, my mouse is way too small. There we go. So here we have dendrites. These are these branches. They receive a signal. They carry it to the cell body. The cell body has the nucleus. There's your nucleus. It has all the normal cell parts. But if the signal is strong enough to be passed on, it then goes down the axon. The axon is surrounded with these other cells, the neuroglia cells. Some of them, looks like the ones in this picture, are called Schwann cells. Anyway, we'll talk about that more. But we have a myelin sheath. Think of that as like insulation. What it is that cell grows around the axon. And so what you're left with is a layer of membrane. That makes it really difficult for ions to get across the wall of the axon at that location. All right, let's move on. Some axons are covered in myelin. like the one we we're just looking at. It says a fatty substance. Yeah, it's fatty. It's a phospholipid. It's membrane. So, okay, nerves, like your nerve fibers, those are bundles of axons going to or from the brain and spinal cord. I'm talking about things like your sciatic nerve, the big nerve in your hip. All right, let's move on. Neuroglia, those are the support cells, are different types. And it says you've got 9 of those every one neuron. Their main function, like I said, remember, they're not just insulation. Obviously, they form the myelin sheath like we just talked about, but support and nourish the neurons, okay? They will provide it with chemicals that it needs. So, these neuroglia, it says they take up more than half of the volume of the brain. Understand that the brain works the way it does because there are so many support cells, so many neuroglia. All right, we've got that. All right, we're another one of those check your progress. You can pause this, see if you can answer those questions. If not, you'll go back, rewatch. I'll wait here. Start the video when you're ready to go on. Okay, let's move on. So, epithelial tissue. This is the 4th of the types of tissues. Remember, we're talking tissues. We had connective tissue. We had nervous tissue. 4th? Hold on. Let's see. Maybe the 3rd. Let's see. Brain. Oh, yeah, we did muscular. Yeah, so we did connective tissue. We did muscular tissue. We did nervous tissue. We're now going to talk about the 4th one. It's the epithelial tissue. All righty. Yeah. All right. So epithelial tissue, we're going to talk about different types. The big one, of course, we're going to talk about the skin, the integumentary system. But lots of epithelial tissue in the body. It's not just on the surface. Sorry, it's not just on the outer surface. So let's go ahead here. Epithelial tissue is made out of tightly packed cells. It lines body cavities, covers the surface of the body. I'm talking about like the skin. It's found in glands. You have cells that are hooked to a basement membrane on one side and free on the other. They're named for cell layers and shapes. Okay, we've done this before. What we're talking about there with layers or non-layering, if we say it is a simple epithelial tissue, it's got one layer. If we say that it is striated, has 2 or more, okay? Striations, if you go to a canyon, a mountain, the bare side, sometimes you're driving down the road, you see a place, they cut through the rock to put the road, and you see stripes of rock, different kinds of rock in layers. Well, those layers are called striations. If you got more than one layer of cells, we say it's striated. And then shape of the cells. Well, I'm sure they're going over this, but if you have a tall vertical cell, looks kind of like the column, the architectural column in front of a building, we say it's columnar tissue. If it is like a soda can that you stepped on and squashed flat, we say it is squamous. The SQ can remind you it's squashed flat. Those would be really flattened cells. Your outer layer, your skin is full of squamous cells. We'll talk about why in a bit. If a cell is shaped kind of like a Rubik's Cube, we say it is cuboidal. All right, moving on. So epithelial tissue, it's either simple or stratified. Simple, you got a single layer of cells. If you have more than one layer, if you have more than one strata, it is stratified tissue. Great. All right, and here we have our pictures. We have simple, we have stratified, and notice there's one in between here, pseudo-stratified. I don't really like that drawing. It's a little too realistic. What I mean by that is a lot of times it's sloppy like this, but more often you have a long, tall cell and a long, tall cell, long, tall cell. Imagine this middle cell here goes all the way up to the top. Now imagine these have a nucleus here and here. The one in the middle has a nucleus down here. They almost look like separate layers. They're the same cells, same tissue, same layer. We would call that pseudo-stratified. It's not really stratified, it just looks like it. Now here we have stratified cuboidal, and up here we have stratified squamous. See how those squash flat cells, when you form strata, you can pack a lot of cells into the same layer. That's one of the things that's really, really common. Anywhere on the body that you expect a lot of abrasion, a lot of rubbing, you don't want a simple tissue. You can like rub one cell off and now you've broken that layer. So like your outer layer, your skin, definitely stratified squamous. In fact, we would say it is keratinized stratified squamous. That means it's full of the protein keratin. It makes it tough. But you want it to resist abrasion, resist rubbing, and not be able to rub off all the layers. That's why you have lots of layers. All right, moving on. So simple squamous, single layer of flattened cells. Good example, the alveoli inside the lungs. All right. Why is it squamous? Why is it flattened? Because it's thin. You don't have much tissue between the air and the blood. There's not much space. It's easy to transfer oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide out of the blood into the air to breathe away. So if it was simple cuboidal, it would be a single layer of cube-shaped cells. Glomerulus and kidney, maybe. But yeah, so you've got these single layer, it's simple. Oh, yep, kidney. They used the other end. They didn't talk about the glomerulus. They're talking about the collecting ducts, tubules, proximal and distal convoluted tubule. But anyway, kidney. So yeah, simple squamous. That's going to be lining of the alveoli and the lungs, wall of the alveoli. Simple cuboidal, that will be the tubes inside the kidney that pass fluids back and forth, pump ions in and out. You're controlling the composition of what will become the urine. At that point, we call it filtrate because we're filtering it. We don't call it urine yet, but yeah, that's the future urine inside the tube, and you have simple cuboidal for the wall of the tube. All right, so simple columnar, single layer of column-shaped cells. Easy. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Already talked about that. It looks like it's multiple layers, but it's not. Pseudo, fake, stratified. So pseudostratified, it looks like it's got the layers, but it's actually simple. It's one layer. Columnar, they're tall and thin. So because of the location of the nuclei, it appears stratified, but every cell is actually attached to the same basement membrane. often has cilia. Cells that have cilia, we say are ciliated. So you could be ciliated columnar epithelium. That means you have little hairs, little cilia on the surface that help to move things around usually. Like the lining of your trachea. Air coming in, it might have dirt and other nastiness. They get caught in the mucus. And then you have little cilia that are going here. Little cilia, they're going, they're passing that mucus full of rubbish and stuff you don't want in the lungs. Pass it up to the back of the throat where you can swallow it down to the stomach. And then any bacteria you breathe in, you can kill them. It'll work real well. All right, so simple columnar, lining the intestine. Yeah, that's good. Notice, even though they didn't say it, they should have said ciliated simple columnar. You can see the layer of little cilia hair right there. And lining of the trachea, pseudostratified columnar. I guess I already used that example. Weeps impurities towards the throat. Sounds so formal, and it doesn't have the sound effects. But it's those cilia that are moving things up the throat, moving the mucus and all of the junk that's stuck in that mucus up where you can swallow it down and destroy it. All right, so glands. They've got one or more types of cells that make and secrete a product. You have two types of glands. Exocrine, empty into ducts. Endocrine, empty straight into the bloodstream. They've got no ducts. All right. So stratified means you've got more than one layer. You could have stratified squamous, says forms the outer layer of the skin, lines the mouth, the esophagus. All true, but I want to add something here. The outer layer of the skin is tough and really, really abrasion resistant. That is keratinized. Protein keratin is in it, it makes it tough. Now, if you feel right here, the inner lining of your cheek, you know how that's softer, not as tough? No keratin or very little keratin. So they're both, if you think about it, when you're chewing food in your mouth, there's lots of rubbing and abrasion. So what I said is still true. Stratified squamous happens in a place where you have lots of abrasion, lots of rubbing, and you need to be able to not have catastrophic failure if one or two cells get rubbed off. But there are areas where you want it to be really tough, like the outer layer of the body, outer side of the body, and you put a lot of keratin. And there are areas where you don't need it to be quite as tough, like here, and so it's not keratinized. Anyway, transitional epithelia can change shape. Think of your bladder, how it stretches when it fills with fluid. That's the thing they're talking about there. All right. So stratified squamous, lining the nose, the mouth, the esophagus, the anal canal, the vagina. What? I thought it was for abrasion resistance. Yeah, it is. If you think of the anal canal, well, let's go through this. Lining of the nose. Well, you have things get in there you don't want. You might inhale a bug or something, but it's going to be tougher. So you have multiple layers. That's the one that seems a little iffy. Mouth, esophagus, obviously, you're chewing, you're swallowing, you're passing things along this, coming down the esophagus, you're passing a bolus of food down, it's rubbing on the wall of the esophagus. You don't want to rub that away and have a wound. So stratified squamous makes it thick. Anal canal, kind of disgusting, but you're pooping out the poo, you're getting rid of the feces, they're rubbing on the wall as they go by. Right. Vagina. If someone is sexually active, there's probably some rubbing and abrasion going on there. Again, stratified squamous, it's abrasion resistant. Oh, another one of those checks. I'll leave you to it. Pause the video. Start up when you're ready to keep going.